I don't know how many times I've read the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith through in my life. As a convert to the church in college, it felt like scripture to me, right? It was the prophet Joseph. And so because I was so enamored with the restoration, for me, this was a wildly important text. And, you know, in my years of teaching, I found myself quoting the prophet a lot. And so when it began to kind of fall out of favor in a positive way, right, where the Joseph Smith paper stuff was teaching us that these quotes weren't always accurate, I felt a little heartened at the idea that this foundational text would just be lost to the church, because it is kind of the ultimate compilation of Joseph's most significant teachings. There's some we quote that are outside of DPJS, but generally speaking, this was the thing. And so for me, I don't know that I felt so much of a calling as just a sense of, I want to be able to quote this. And, you know, I had the Joseph Smith Papers volumes. I would regularly go looking for stuff in it. And then there was this transition saying, you can't quote DPJS anymore. You can't quote the history of the church anymore. You got to go to those volumes. And so I would go to the website. But sometimes, even when I knew I had the quote accurately, the website couldn't bring it up.
Jesus land if they live righteously.
It is time for another episode of the Cultural Hall, and I'm excited to have this interview episode a couple of great scholars. You can tell that they're scholars for a couple of reasons. One, they have written a book, and two, they are surrounded by books, especially if you're able to see the video of this. I'm joined by Rich Moore, Alonzo Gaskell. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, and it's important that I add the revised and expanded, because there's already a teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. Who wants to tell me about why? Well, let's go back even before that, the original and what we're doing here with the revised and expanded.
Let me start. If I'm not mistaken, Alonzo, correct me along the way here. Teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith was compiled by Joseph Fielding Smith, and it was originally published in 1938. And it was consistently published through the years, always on the shelves of Deseret Book and other places and that's where I don't know. When was the last publication, Alonzo? Do you know?
I think the last was 76, but obviously that one stayed in print.
Right. And so it's been on the shelves until not that many years ago, a few years ago, it was finally taken off the shelves at Deseret Book because of the Joseph Smith papers. And I think BYU professors were told, if you're writing a paper or a book or anything, don't, use the Joseph Smith papers. Don't use teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith anymore, because it was edited and there are better things out there now.
And so the effort of the revised and expanded is to what, Alonzo?
Well, in essence, what we're trying to do is go back to the earliest manuscripts, because Joseph Fielding Smith often took notes from people who had heard Joseph speak. And in some cases, it's a couple of words here or a couple of lines there. And he expanded on that to create a coherent quote. Wasn't being dishonest. I mean, it was a pretty common approach in the day. But in essence, the challenge that we ran up against was a book that has all these quotes that people have quoted for years in the church and continue to quote in general conference. Now had kind of fallen out of favor because we weren't really sure Joseph said some of those things. In some cases, because it was a secondhand or third-hand comment that was attributed to Joseph, but in many cases, it was an expansion of quotes. So Rich, who doesn't look anything like Joseph, he and I were talking the other night about the fact that if you look at the rough stone rolling quote, it's a few words that has been turned into an entire paragraph. And I mentioned jokingly to Rich that, Joseph originally didn't say, I'm like a rough stone rolling. He said, I'm like a bag of peat moss. Just kidding, Rich. Yeah. Rich said, don't say that, because it won't translate into something funny on a podcast.
No, I thought it was great. I
threw all caution to the wind. Look, but this is a prime example, right, of something that we've got a pretty fragmented statement. Joseph clearly references being like a rough stone rolling, but Joseph Fielding Smith tries to then expound on that and give you kind of a coherent idea of what Joseph was probably thinking. But if you're to quote that quote as it appears in the original teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, you essentially are quoting Joseph Fielding Smith, not the prophet Joseph. And so for us, the issue was this kind of love of things the prophet Joseph had taught, being told, hey, don't quote that original text, finding that most people are not going to have access to the dozens and dozens of volumes from the Joseph Smith Papers Project. You sometimes find it a little bit hard to navigate that website and find what you're looking for. And so really our goal was to say, you know what, there are teachers of the gospel, there are academics, there are members who just loved that old book and the quotes. This is a way to help them to safely go into it and say, okay, here's the original quote that Joseph Fielding Smith gave us. Let's look right across the page from it and say, what do we have in the earliest source that Joseph actually said? And we can quote that more accurately. We can see what's been kind of expanded upon by Joseph Fielding Smith and get us back to what we can say with some degree of certainty that Joseph actually commented, as opposed to what's been kind of created in his name.
Let me just say on that rough stone rolling, it was rough stone rolling downhill was all that was written. And it wasn't Joseph Fielding Smith who expanded it. It was the early church historians after they got to Utah. They have that written, and they have memories of him saying things, and they have some other things were written down, and they expanded it, and Joseph Fielding Smith used it from some of the histories because he was the church historian. He had access to these histories that were never published, really, but they would take from them and publish the history books we do have. But yeah, they just expanded it. And to be fair, maybe some of them were there when he said it, and maybe they remembered some of the things, but yeah, rough stone rolling downhill to a paragraph or two. Yeah.
And that's an important clarification. I don't want to imply that Joseph Fielding Smith is the problem in all this, but also, they're taking all of these sources. I want to say it was George A. Smith that at one point sent out a thing saying, hey, if you've got any memories, recollections, anything from the prophet, please bring it to the historian's office. And they would take those scraps and amalgamate them to try and create as consistent of a quote as they could. And from, just the standards of the day, that was considered appropriate and common. But, Rich and I just went back and said, okay, let's get back to the earliest we can possibly find, and scrap a lot of the amalgamation and just say, what's the earliest record?
What I find fascinating about this is, Joseph Smith probably, it's not a competition, but probably one of the most quoted prophets, leaders of the church. And I think that we're in a day and an age where what was actually said, or maybe and I'm air quoting for people that can't see, that what the original is, it is very important that people know what the exact thing, or as near as the exact thing that was said, can be able to be shared. Just because we're in a day and an age where people feel like everyone has had a chance to put their spin on something, that has had their chance to put a little something more to it, that to be able to, change it to be able to suit their purposes. Is it within what you guys have done within this? Have there been things where we have that quote that we know we love? I'm thinking of things like teach them correct principles and let them guide them themselves, or the standard of truth, or some of these things that when we go back to the original, we go, wow, this is a little bit different than I think we've made it out to be. There's something, maybe a different meaning or a higher meaning or deeper meaning when we go back to what that original thing was.
There are some of those. Some of those were hard to find. That teach them correct principles, let them govern themselves. I looked for that, honestly, even before we started the book, for years, and finally found it in a talk by John Taylor. And he said, Joseph Smith said this, but that's one of the challenges I think we found was that, and I think anyone who understands that era and history, we don't have tape recordings of anything that anybody said. You don't get George Watt is the first British convert, and he knew Pitman shorthand, and he gets to Nauvoo about 1842, but the first shorthand we have of his is 1845 after Joseph's dead. So I don't know if he did anything with Joseph's stuff or not, but Joseph had scribes, but they weren't using shorthand. They were just writing as fast as they could. So, do we have exact quotes of anything? Now, I think if there was something he dictated in a history, then I think we're pretty safe. I think if there was a letter that he dictated or something he wrote himself, we're pretty safe. But if they're just sitting in the audience taking longhand notes and then trying to remember them later or trying to expand them or something, it becomes I think you just have to take the quotes. I'm not trying to dismiss the quotes, you know.
Sure.
I, you know, I went to when I was at BYU. My religion professor said, "Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith is the fifth standard work." So I was raised with the idea that, oh my gosh, this is a vitally important book, and I've had it, you know, since I was 19. But
Well, and on that
uh,
same note, my mission president, who taught here adjunct for like 16 years, said if I were to do it all over, I would stick to the standard works and the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. And I was like, whoa, oh, okay, okay. So it carried a lot of clout.
it did. I
Well,
think we were trying to restore it a little bit to say, you know, if you remember the old teachings, if you were a fan of the old teachings, if that's what you had for years, just, you know, this will help by showing you maybe the original or the earliest source.
Yeah. And you know, Richie, one thing that maybe along the lines of what Rich has said, you have famous quotes like happiness is the object and the design of our existence and shall be the end thereof, that we quote over and over again. The source we have for that is John C. Bennett. Is that right, Rich?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, and the document in which it is found, he's coming out as an antagonist and attacking. And yet, you know, there are a lot of Saint scholars that think it's still Joseph, but it's the one source that we have. And so one of the things this project has caused, I think, both Rich and I to do is to pretty consistently now say there's a comment attributed to the prophet Joseph, or, you know, the prophet Joseph is said to have taught, because even where we've got something where we say, no, this is definitely Joseph. It's not secondary in the sense of, you know, like a John C. Bennett or someone else, John Taylor. You still have to ask the question, since in the early years of Joseph's life, you might be lucky to have one account. In Nauvoo, you start getting multiple people that are recording stuff. The earliest things, both in this teachings volume, but just generally speaking, you're at least limited to a singular source, and you have to put a lot of trust in that one person. By the time you get to Nauvoo, you're getting multiple people that are taking notes, and at least thankfully, then you can kind of compare and contrast things. So when you look at the King Follett discourse, we not only have an amalgamated version in our version of Teachings of Prophet Joseph Smith, but we've also got as an appendix a 4 version one in columns where you can kind of compare, and you see the same guys are sitting for the same discourse, but what strikes them, what they record, is oftentimes really different. And so as a consequence, at least then you can survey that and say, okay, we've got 4 different people writing this, and we can get a pretty good sense of what was said. But in some of the earliest stuff, there just has to be extreme caution because you have one person making notes and nobody really having this sense. It's almost like with the New Testament, right? All this is unfolding and nobody's recording any of this. And it's years later that you get Gospels written. But you know, it isn't in Paul is really the first thing people start saying, hey, hang on to some of this stuff. So, you know, it's this kind of looking back in retrospect and saying, maybe this is going to be important later. And initially they just didn't sense that. And so there wasn't this feeling of, well, we got to get this down because this is a one-time thing. We never know if we're going to have this for the future. And it's in retrospect that I think they start saying, oh man alive, and trying to recreate what they remembered Joseph said.
You know, and when we talk King Follett, you're right, you have 4 different sources, but what strikes me is I think you can read the King Follett sermon in what, 20 minutes, maybe less. But I found several sources that said he spoke for over 2 hours. One said he spoke for 2 hours and 15 minutes. So if you got 20 or 30 minutes of King Follett, and what were the other things he said, and why weren't they recorded? Maybe they weren't that important to the scribes. I don't know, but I would like to have been there for that.
The thing I found is, as Rich and I sat next to each other reading these documents and, you know, checking our transcription, and I found that Rich would take the 20-minute King Follett discourse as we have it, and it would take him 2 hours to read it. And so it felt like we were recreating the experience.
I have trouble with some words.
Listen, let's just sound them out. You'll get there. I want to know
the small words.
Yeah. So who came to who? How did this, you know, hey, the boys are getting back together, and that book that's had a tremendous impact on our life, You want to revise and expand it? How did the actual project of this book come about? Who, what, how, and then let's do it. What was the length of time that it took? This is a hefty volume, gentlemen.
We spent a decade on it. Initially I had hired some research assistants, and they weren't always as careful as we wanted, and we'd go back and find stuff and be like, oh, gee whiz. And they did good, but it wasn't as intuitive for them. Rich, do you remember how early into the project you started working on this with me?
It was fairly early. I think you'd done some, like you said, you had some research assistants who did stuff. And then I think this was Alonzo's idea. It was his baby all along, So if there's anything wrong with it, that's just him.
If there's anything wrong with it, it is the mistakes of man. I get it.
Yeah, that's right.
I get it.
Yeah. We're always at fault.
But he just called me one time and said, man, they were looking for something and couldn't find it. And I thought, they couldn't find it. It's right there, and so he actually checked with the powers that be at BYU, and I was initially hired as a adjunct researcher to find the things, and so that's how I came on board. And so I think I did that for 3 years, and then I think they ran out of funds.
So then he did it for free.
Yeah, yeah. So
Richie, one of the things we had to do was, I don't know how many times we went through, but we're literally, I've got my transcript here. Rich is reading out of a volume or off of one of the documents out loud. I'm going through and comparing. We had not a lot, but just a couple of spots where a word for the Joseph Smith papers in the original document, we could not see it as the same as they did. And so, we were like, yeah, we get, this is your transcription. We see the transcription slightly different. And Rich spent a significant amount of time when he was working on Oliver only, working through these original documents, getting used to handwriting, etc. And, we'd often go back to these originals and look and say, yeah, we see it slightly different, and have to put in a footnote that this is how the JSP has interpreted it. We see it as this. And so it was just painstaking going through multiple times to this entire text, word for word, literally, to make sure we were as accurate as we possibly could be. We certainly trusted the Joseph Smith Papers folks, who have done a remarkable, phenomenal thing, a contribution that is just incalculable. And so no criticism there. They often were helpful as we would reach out to them about stuff. But we also tried to do our own thing and make sure we could at least say, no, we've gone through this multiple times ourselves. We weren't just relying on them or a cut and paste or anything like that. It just wasn't feasible to do something like that.
It wasn't just word for word. I was reading like the prophet, capital Joseph said, comma, quotation mark. I was reading every punctuation to make sure we had it right.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was fun.
Yeah.
No, not fun.
You and I have a different definition of fun. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about the personal responsibility in something like this, whether that was a lot of weight, whether you felt like it was a calling. Some of that, we'll come back and do that in the second block of the Cultural Hall. I had an email from someone who listens to the Cultural Hall. I believe it was not a lifer, but a convert, who said, hey, Richie, are you still teaching the podcast classes? And the answer is yes. In fact, I have even fine-tuned it more than I ever had before. So you might be asking, well, Richie, how do I get in on that? Well, you can always email contact@theculturalhall.com, or you can find me on social media wherever I'm at, Richie T. Stedman, and reach out and say, hey, I listen to the Cultural Hall. I would love to learn more about podcasting or your podcasting services, a class, a cohort. There's a group of people. I've even taught the ward historian about podcasting, what it is and how it might be a great benefit to people. If that's something that you're interested in, whether it's for your business or just for your private hobby, maybe something you see your future in, would love to be able to help you along the way. You can find me again anywhere on social media, Richie T. Stedman, or you can just contact us, contact@theculturalhall.com. Look forward to hearing from you. Let us podcast together. To be clear, this is still a show. Here in the second block of the Cultural Hall, remember, you can always become a Patreon saint of the Cultural Hall. If you go to patreon.com/the Cultural Hall, we call it putting your money where your ears are. It helps us, just like there was funding for this project that ended up drying up. Do you want the Cultural Hall to dry up? Would you like that? Is that what you want? No. Go to patreon.com/The Cultural Hall, as little as like $5 a month. Listen, you're subscribing to wonderful treats for your ears. Patreon.com/The Cultural Hall. Now, this is a significant text, as you guys have both sort of highlight that, mission presidents, leaders, etc., have said, hey, the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, in addition to our standard works, maybe Jesus the Christ is up there. There's a couple other that we would maybe point to. And so you guys decide to come alongside and be like, hey, this great thing, we're going to give it a little more depth. We're going to give it a little bit more expansion, revision, all of these things. Tell me, was this, and maybe we start with Alonzo because this was sort of your baby, as Rich mentioned. Was this like a calling? Is this a thing that God planted in your brain and said, hey, we need to do this, get after this? Or how for you did this come about? And then because it's such a significant text, both for the church and for you personally, how did you prepare yourself to be able to do it?
Well, the Angel Moroni's wife, Roberta, came to me.
Didn't know it was
just
Roberta.
Kidding. Just kidding. A calling would be dramatic. I think, to be completely honest, my thought was simply this. I don't know how many times I've read the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith through in my life. As a convert to the church in college, it felt like scripture to me, right? It was the prophet Joseph. And so because I was so enamored with the restoration, for me, this was a wildly important text. And, in my years of teaching, I found myself quoting the prophet a lot. And so when it began to kind of fall out of favor in a positive way, right, where the Joseph Smith paper stuff was teaching us that these quotes weren't always accurate, I felt a little disheartened at the idea that this foundational text would just be lost to the church, because it is kind of the ultimate compilation of Joseph's most significant teachings. Mm-hmm. There are some we quote that are outside of TPJS, but generally speaking, this was the thing. And so for me, I don't know that I felt so much of a calling as just a sense of, I want to be able to quote this. And, I had the Joseph Smith Papers volumes. I would regularly go looking for stuff in it. And then there was this transition saying, you can't quote TPJS anymore. You can't quote the history of the church anymore. You got to go to those volumes. And so I would go to the website. But sometimes, even when I knew I had the quote accurately, the website couldn't bring it up. Mm-hmm. I was on the website this morning and typed in something that absolutely was there, and it just ground. I don't know what's going on, but the little circle was going, and I thought, well, I can't get it. And so my point was that I started thinking, look, I want for myself a singular place where I can quickly go and find these quotes and get them accurate, because I'm still going to be citing them in class, in publications, etc. And I was working at home this last week, and I had my revised and expanded version of Teaching Prophet Joseph Smith, and I could find stuff, but my Joseph Smith Papers volumes were in my office. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have access to them, but I could grab the book and literally in 30 seconds find the quote, cross over and say, okay, how exactly am I supposed to be quoting this? And so for me, it was initially more of I need this for my research. And I had friends who said, oh man, I'm just having such a hard time finding these things. And so it started out as this kind of passion project of, they can take it out of print, but I need to be able to have access to these and ready access. And I found that the hard copy volumes and the website, massive contribution, but weren't always as accessible as I needed them. And so that's what really inspired it. And then as I started into it, I thought, oh, you know what, this shouldn't just be mine. Mm-hmm. Other people ought to have access to this as well. And, Rich and I, as we started going into this, thought, nobody may be willing to even publish this. And if that's the case, then maybe we end up just putting it on Amazon as a free download or something, because we weren't sure whether a publisher would be willing to take on this tome. And if you're not a person who really cares about what he actually said, you might think, well, this is an odd thing to put together. Sure. But just from the perspective of a teacher and a person who believes in the restoration, it was something I needed as a personal tool. And before long, I kind of got a sense of, no, this will be a benefit to other people. This needs to be out there and available.
So Rich, when he hits you up and says, hey, do you know where this is? And you find it, is it a moment of the heavens are opening or a spiritual confirmation? Or
it was all about the money.
Yeah. Tons of money in book writing. I know that, especially academia.
Yeah. No, for me, and Alonzo and I we done things back and forth where he's written something and he'll let me look at it. And and I've written something, and he'll tear it apart. And so that, we've been friends for years and years, and so I was just excited to be part of it. And for me now, I've had people say to me, well, why would you do that? You're just, we got the Joseph Smith papers, but this was really about teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, not everything in the Joseph Smith papers. And by the way, a lot of stuff I found was was not in the Joseph Smith papers. A lot of the things were not in the Joseph Smith papers. They were in Wilford Woodruff's journals. They were in Thomas Bullock's journals. They were in letters. There was one that it's called the Proverbs of Joseph Smith, and I looked through everything I could find. I could not find that. It was on a page in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith. And finally, I contacted the church history library, because they're very good about finding stuff for you. And a couple of weeks later, they just wrote back and said, we can't find it. And then so Alonzo said, well, let me try, because I have a lot more clout than you do. And so he wrote to them, and a couple of weeks they wrote back and said, we can't find it. And so then we actually asked one of the librarians at BYU to ask for it. And they wrote back and said, it can't be found. And finally I said, it's got to be somewhere. And so I called a guy I knew at the church history library, and he said, wow, there's a lot of people looking for that right now. And it was just us, but he said, yeah, they got it. They found it. And it was just one piece of paper that was in so it's not in the Joseph Smith papers. It was just one piece of paper that was in a church history library. I'm looking to see what it is. It was a little paper written by Erastus Derby in 1843 that he said, I was sitting there and Joseph was speaking, and I wrote down these proverbs.
And Erastus, nobody even knows his name anymore, even though he created that really great round hat, the Derby. And so just, and a horse race. He came up with a horse
You're
race.
reaching for that one, man.
Yeah. Well,
I don't want to say fake news, but I think that might be fake news.
Anyway, I was excited to find that. And so just I like searching for things. I kind of enjoy that. Through the years, I've done that for people. They just call me up, say, can you find this? Can you find this? And so that was exciting for me.
So with the book, and we're going back to the original things, I sort of alluded this at the beginning. I think certainly for those who have a great fondness for the original, the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, I know that there's interest for that. Certainly those that would like to quote to cite and all of those things. Are there things that have been aha moments, whether the context of the quote has changed, whether it has given a deeper insight, or whether just the original was a little bit more succinct or more elaborated? I guess what I'm asking is there a part in what you guys found that you went, oh, let me share you this, similar to like what you just said, this mystery chase to try and chase down this thing? Was there something that each of you guys have that's in this book that you're like, oh, this was a tremendous find. This was a great going back to the resource. People will find this to be highly interesting that we've adapted this way, but really I think it was this, and that changed my testimony of such and such a thing. Are there any of those sort of moments within this project?
Rich, what would you say?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of one that went, oh my gosh, that's great. Mine was a little different. It was, I don't want to say it was negative, but in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, sometimes there'll be long articles that were editorials in like the Times and Seasons, like baptism or try the spirits and things like that. So Joseph Smith was the editor of the newspaper at that time. And so that's why I think it was put in. It was not only in the Times and Seasons. I think that's why Joseph Fielding Smith put it in his book, because Joseph Smith was the editor. This is the editorial. But I questioned whether Joseph Smith wrote it or not. I as I would read through those, I'm thinking, this doesn't sound like Joseph. Now, it may have been, or it may have been that he dictated it or wrote it and somebody punched it up and made it a little better, like John Taylor or W.W. Phelps. It may have been he asked John Taylor to write it, and then he read through it and said, "Oh, I totally agree with you. You wrote it just right." So and I've had some people say, "Oh, Joseph absolutely wrote it," but that was my question when it came to the editorials, these long editorials. Uh, I just I just don't know. And I guess if Joseph was the editor and it was in there, he must have approved it.
Right.
But that was my takeaway on that. It was not what you were asking for some. Oh, this is great. It was more of a I don't know. I just
Well,
don't know.
let me ask you a follow-up question on that then. Let's say that it wasn't, or that, that W.W. Phelps was the author of it, but it's attributed to the prophet Joseph Smith. Aside from being, I guess, sort of inaccurate in its attribution, what is that? What is that? What is the takeaway for you from that? Is it that you just want to know that it was? I need to know if it was Joseph Smith, or is it something bigger or grander?
It for me, it's not so much. Well, I'm going to discard that now because I don't know he wrote it. I'm still reading it as if he wrote it, or more likely, he wrote a version and it was maybe fixed a little bit, or at least, if nothing else, he was the editor. It was an editorial. He must have approved it.
Mm-hmm.
So I still read it like whether he wrote it or not. This is good. This is okay. This is legit.
Yeah.
In some cases, the editorials may be, uh, with more certitude, claimed to be approved by Joseph than many of the things that are not published editorials, where people have written out, their version of the talk. Because even though you have certain things where, Joseph seems to be flowing in and out of, English, now using a Latin phrase, and it's probably W.W. Phelps who is enamored with doing stuff like that. Uh, because Joseph is the editor, and Joseph then allows that to come out, and Joseph doesn't correct what's said, you have this sense of, yeah, either Joseph is directly behind this, or he's approved this, it's come out and he's accepting of it. And so, even in those, you have to say, okay, yeah, Joseph is alive at this time. Other quotes that are the amalgamated, that he's not, and we don't know how he would have responded. And so the ones that we discovered where we thought, try the spirits may not be Joseph, it may, or this one where he's using this Latin phrase may not be Joseph's original wording. Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter. At least you have Joseph's stamp of approval by accepting it as a published declaration under his name or pen. The ones where, they get to Utah and they start taking all these scraps of paper and trying to create statements, or Joseph Fielding Smith has fleshed out a statement. Those are the ones where you think, well, we just don't really know. And I would say for me, the biggest epiphany was not, whoa, look at the difference in how this one read, but it was more of what we mentioned earlier. And that is my sense of being more cautious. Sometimes you can look at a text and say, oh, I'm going to go back to the Greek or Hebrew and look at the nuance of the word that was chosen. Or we might erroneously do the same thing in English and say, look at what word he used here, not realizing, well, that wasn't the word Jesus used. But I found myself early on much more inclined to say, interesting, look at the way Joseph stated this. And when Rich and I made it through this project over and over and over again, the thing that it made me do is be much more careful in what we attribute, and much more less inclined to pick at certain phrases or words used as though notice the nuance in Joseph's comment, but instead to say, I don't know if Joseph offered that nuance. He taught these concepts. I don't know what his wording was. And so the big epiphany for me was just realizing Joseph lived in an era where you cannot do what you can with President Nelson and say, interesting choice of words there. Mm-hmm. With Joseph, you really just have to say, there's a painting with a very broad brush. There are ideas he clearly brings up. Some he fleshes out more than others. And we need to be a little bit less dogmatic about some of the nuance that I just didn't realize prior to going through and in detail examining what we could find from the earliest sources. Because even, sources that may be 100 years old still sometimes have already had some massaging or combining. And so you can think, well, this is a 19th century source, though. Well, maybe, but if you go a little bit back further, you still find there's less to the original.
I think one epiphany for me was after we went through all these earliest and original things, whether they be in people's journals or Joseph Smith papers or other things, was how much work Joseph Fielding Smith did to compile this.
With no computer.
Yeah.
He's taking scraps of paper. It's
and to take even just the King Follett discourse itself and how it was put together back in the Times and Seasons, and then it's been re-amalgamated. But to put it together, because I when I went through the King Follett discourse, I broke down every phrase or sentence and where it came from.
Mm.
And I'm thinking, wow, this was a major undertaking. But I was instead of being kind of bothered by Joseph Fielding Smith, I was just incredibly impressed
Yeah.
with what he had done, what he had put together, and honestly, in many, many, many cases, it didn't change that much. It's what he had was accurate, and so
And it really says something about scholars of the past. Today we've got computers and we're not writing
It's not by hand, and we've got databases, and some people may use AI, and you can search the internet, but these are people that are doing this without even indices. When you Talmage's book, Jesus the Christ, some love it, some hate it, but honestly, I look at people like that and I think this guy sat down with a Bible and a fountain pen and scraps of paper and did this. And Rich is right. You've got to give these people credit for accomplishing something that is incomprehensible in the way that they did it.
As you guys were talking kind of about the editorial part of this, there's a thing that's interesting to me, and certainly as you highlighted just then, 21st century, we probably have countless terabytes of President Nelson, and we have, The Voice, and, you could probably, and thank goodness I don't think anyone has done this yet, but make an AI anti-version of President Nelson, and people could believe it, right? Because of all the technology that we have. And yet, even in our day, there's a part of me, like when President Nelson will post on social media, that I think President Nelson approves of this message. I don't imagine that he is sitting down and going, my brothers and sisters, and typing this into his phone. Now, maybe he did, but there is this tremendous takeaway, I think, most recently of his Christmas 2024, where he's sharing a message about the holidays, and there's written text as well as a video of him, playing the piano and wishing us all a Merry Christmas. Do I think that some of that was polished around him? Sure. Do I think that there was some that was written by him? Absolutely. And there's still tremendous worth in that message and the spirit that was received from that. So to your point, Rich, whether these things were sort of massaged or whether they were the literal word, it's important that we don't just go, well, we don't know, so throw it out. Unless I can say, I know, we're going to just throw that thing out.
Yeah, and that's especially true. I mean, you talked about currently, but when you get in the past, when you do history, it's just compiling history. I remember being a student, in history classes, and we reading the book and go, oh, that's the way it happened. That's what, that's the way it was. That's, Walter Cronkite. That's the way it was. And I realize you're too young to know that, aren't you?
No, I know that's the way it was.
Okay. But I found out later that no, it isn't. It's somebody's interpretation, or what you do is, as a historian, you go back to the past and you have bits and pieces, little pieces of things, and then you try to piece together the history. And I found that this is true with with teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. There are bits and pieces. Sometimes they're large. There would be Willard Richards' book, where he was just taking notes of things Joseph said, or William Clayton, who was going around as a scribe and writing down things, but still, so it's piecing those all together and trying to come up with, this is what Joseph Smith said, this is what he was like, and it's their best guess, and I think they did an amazing job. But still, there's no absolute guarantee. I think we just have to say, I'm gonna read this and get what I can out of it, and go from there. I remember reading something he said. This is years ago, and it was different from the way I understood it to be doctrine. And I talked to Robert J. Matthews, and he said, "Oh, don't worry about that. We know the doctrine, so just go with that." And that was kind of, well, to me, I was trying to show and prove every little thing, And honestly, it can't be done. You cannot prove every little thing.
Hmm. I would be curious to ask you guys kind of this sidebar question, then we'll take a quick break. We take a tremendous amount of focus within the church for a life fairly shortly lived. We spend a tremendous amount of time, volumes and volumes. We talk about the Joseph Smith papers. That's millions of dollars. And I'm not just talking about trying to buy the volumes. I'm talking about, the work that went into that. And now the church, probably people know this, but putting together a biography about Joseph Smith that will be released in the next couple years. That project is happening. A tremendous amount about Joseph Smith, and we get a similar-ish treatment about Brigham Young, and then we sort of disappear, it seems. Is it because of the amount of work, the amount of restoration, the significance of the things done under the prophet Joseph Smith, that's where we spend so much time? And or is it just because of proximity and time that it's far enough that we're sort of fascinated by it, whereas a Lorenzo Snow or some of those early 19th century prophets, 20th century prophets, we just haven't spent the time yet?
Don't you think, Richie, that, I mean, Joseph Smith is ultimately the architect in that, the restoration begins with him. And you maybe could push that back and even say the Reformation is part of the setting up of all of this. But nonetheless, sure, Joseph, guided by God, is the one who ends up kind of building the ship. Everybody else has been assigned to kind of steer it and get it where it needs to go. And certainly we have been talking a lot in the last few years about the restoration continues.
Mm-hmm.
But the way in which the restoration continues is almost without exception building on what Joseph provided. When you think about the dramatic changes in our form of temple worship under President Nelson, and how much that has evolved while he's been president of the church, I think you see that, certainly Revelation's still coming and things are being added, tweaked, developed, etc. But we're still tracing that back to a restoration of an endowment through Joseph that we're now steering and guiding and massaging. And so I think when you look at what Joseph Smith did, there are ways in which, and this is nothing critical of Lorenzo Snow, but you're in a scenario where you say, Lorenzo got that ship and turn that corner with our financial challenges, for example, and tithing, and that couplet with deification when he was an apostle. But it's all going back to what Joseph initially restored. And so for me, I think, and this is one reason why, again, the book becomes important, it's Joseph. Yeah. It's the prophet of the restoration. And the living prophet trumps anything in the past, but all of our living prophets and apostles since this dispensation began are drawing on what God revealed to and through the prophet Joseph Smith. And therefore, when Joseph makes that comment about, Jesus and him crucified is the fundamental principle and everything else is an appendage to that, I think you can say that same thing with the restoration, that Joseph is the restoring prophet and everything else is an appendage to what he originally gave, even though that restoration continues through absolutely inspired modern prophets and apostles. But they're restoring a fuller version of what we still trace back to Joseph over and over and over again.
What say you, Rich?
Oh, I totally agree with that. And then you talk about Brigham Young, and I think with him the difference is, one, he's a little more controversial because he was the president of church, I think, longer than anybody else. And there's so much that he's there. I did my dissertation on Brigham Young, and when I was trying to do the research there are, at that time, there were boxes and boxes of uncatalogued things for Brigham Young. And so I don't know that we've even scratched the surface for Brigham Young entirely. But, and again, it's still the early, it's Joseph. And then a lot of the saints at that time thought Joseph was not only the prophet, but would be the prophet and usher in the second coming, that there'd be only the one prophet. And so when Brigham Young took over, I think there had to be a shift in thinking, and now Brigham is the prophet, and so I think as time goes on, it might be, well, Joseph, well, now it's Brigham, well, now it's John Taylor, and then maybe we lose a little bit, and unless it's current with President Nelson, but the young people don't know Spencer W. Kimball. You know,
Mm.
young people, they don't know. Uh, they don't know some of these prophets that I'm very familiar with, because that was
They
my
don't even
time.
remember President Hinckley.
Yeah,
Yeah,
some.
They'll recognize the name, but I'll
yeah.
ask class, how many of you remember President Hinckley? And people are like, nah, I've heard the name. I don't remember him at all.
I mean, not even the prophets. You know, we used to say, "Well, this was doctrinally." Bruce McConaughey said this, and you say that now, and most young people go, "Who?"
Yeah.
And I'm writing for curriculum for the institute, and they say, I find a great quote from Wilford Woodruff, and they go, find somebody that they know, find
Mhm.
somebody they know, because it's like they're gone now. That it doesn't matter to them who they were. So,
And interestingly, we have doctrinally focused apostles today, but Joseph Fielding Smith, Bruce R. McConkie had an opinion on everything. They were very, very doctrinal. It is so easy to find an answer to a question in one of their publications. It's a little bit more difficult now to find, and maybe that's because the brethren are more careful about expounding opinion as opposed to doctrine. But when you're writing curriculum or writing a book, an article, you can find comments by them on everything, which made them so convenient. But now that we are so many years distant from them, you have to go to the well of the living prophets and apostles, or at least those within modern memory, and that makes it a little bit more challenging.
I want to take a break right here. Gentlemen, when we come back in the third block, there are 3 questions we ask everyone who steps into the Cultural Hall. I'll ask those of you, plus I got another question or 2 up my sleeve. We'll come back and do that in the third block of the Cultural Hall. BestDJinUtah.com is the website. That is where you go if you would like me to come and DJ your event. Now, will I do a family reunion where you all wear the same t-shirts? You bet I will. Will I travel to wherever you're at? Uh-huh. Am I reasonable as far as what I cost? Yes. Yes. Do I bring a good time? Yeah, all the things. Listen, Best DJ in Utah, it's my company. It's a thing I do that allows me to be able to have the time to do the Cultural Hall. So if someone's getting married, you think, man, they need a great DJ. You're throwing a party, whether it's a 50th or 60th or 40th or 20th or whatever the party is. I've done them all and would love to be able to do that. An anniversary party, certainly done those. I did a baptism in 2023. Yeah, we did a big dance party at a baptism. Spoiler, not a Mormon baptism, but it was fun nonetheless. BestDJinUtah.com is a website. I will get back to you within 24 hours with a quote. Come on now. BestDJinUtah.com. Here in the third block of the Cultural Hall, remember, you can always send us an email, contact@theculturalhall.com. If there was a question that they wish I would have asked Rich and Alonzo, I know them well enough to know that I can email them 30 times and then I'll finally get an answer down the road. So send that question along, contact@theculturalhall.com. Or if you have a great guest suggestion, someone that you think, oh, I love that episode, but who you also need to talk to is this person, contact@theculturalhall.com is the email address. Send that to us. So you now have this may be a little bit more for Alonzo. You have this baby, this project. It's done. I'm holding it in my hand. It's out in the world. And now as you kind of look back in retrospect, is it, oh, we should have done this? Is it, oh, listen, my mind left that long ago, and now I'm working on this completely other thing? Now that the book is done, where has your mind gone about this project that took a literal decade of your life?
Well, I'll tell you, I use the book pretty much every day. Crazy thing is, I got one next to my keyboard here, and I've used it several times today. So it isn't out of sight, out of mind. But in essence, I'm on to other things. I'm working on a couple of other books, got a couple of articles in the works. And so I've kind of moved on in that regard, but I'm finding it extremely helpful and I'm grateful for that. So yeah, I often, once I get done with the project, I just move on and, don't think about it again because you just got other stuff that's flooding in constantly, but grateful to have access to it the way I wanted when I first started working on it.
When you quote your book, this is more of a personal question, I guess. When you quote your book, do you say things like I put together in my book, the revised and expanded teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, when you're sure? I'm just teasing.
Rich asked me to quote it, Alonzo L. Gaskill and the ultimate male Rich Moore. But I instead quoted Alonzo L. Gaskill and the Tennessee Ernie Ford lookalike, because that seems more appropriate. But No, I mean, in essence, what I'm doing is I'm quoting Joseph Smith, and then in the reference, just citing where in the book it can be found.
Just giving you a hard time. Just giving you a
I
hard
know
time.
I'm hurt and stressed now that you said it. But
Oh,
okay.
no, don't do that.
Oh man. Okay.
Rich, what about for you? Is this done and you're like, man, you want to do the excitement towards future projects?
I'm so glad it's done. That last 6 months when we were going through and correcting every little thing we could find and going through it, piece by piece and letter by letter. I was just tired of it. So I'm glad it's done. I hope even before it came out, I saw criticism on social media of the book coming out, thinking we were trying to redo what Joseph Smith papers have done, and it really has. It has. It's really not that at all. It's with teachings. I hope it will find some. I hope some people will find it helpful. We both thought it would be incredibly helpful to some people, and we hope that's the case. Other than that, I just don't want to ever work with Alonzo again on anything.
Me either.
That's my goal, So, no, I'm not working on anything. I was saying to somebody last night, I don't. The only project I have right now is just this working with the Institute curriculum group, and so that's what I'm doing right now. I don't have any plans for. Somebody asked me. Oh, it was a Greg Koford who did this book. This is
worth mentioning. You guys didn't know whether or not anyone would pick up and publish this. Greg Koford books. There's a link to be able to purchase this in the show notes. And if this has interested you at all, I encourage you to purchase that book for a few reasons. One, what a great resource. Two, it allows things like this to be published in the future. So, sorry to interject that said.
So last time I saw him, and he was very interested in publishing. We had some places that were not interested. We had some places that were tentatively interested, but he was just all over it. He was very excited to do it. And he asked me last time I saw him, he said, I understand you wrote your master's thesis on this. And I go, yeah. And he said, you ever think of making a book out of that? And I went, I never actually have thought of making a book out of that. But and he's good about stuff like this. When he asked me to do the Oliver Olney book, you've never heard of Oliver Olney, and
No.
I think 7 out of 10 church history professors would probably have never heard of Oliver Olney. But I made a presentation on him at the John Whitmer Historical Association conference, and he said, "I want that book." And I actually said to him, "No one will buy that book." He goes, "Oh." He says, "Oh, I know." He said, "Well," he says, some libraries, some universities, and a few diehard church history fans might get it. But he said, every year I do some that I know will sell well, and every year I do some that I know won't sell, but I think ought to be done.
Yeah.
And that's yours. That's what he said. That is yours. So I did that. So, I don't know, maybe someday I'll reconsider, because he told me, think about it. Think about your master's thesis and maybe doing something with that. So I don't know.
Well, then let me reiterate what Greg Koford said to you. Think about it, Rich. Think about it.
Richie, I will say also, we were very careful when I first had the thought of doing this to reach out to the Joseph Smith Papers folks and say, are you going to do this? And they had said no. Later in the project, I reached out again. Are you sure? And they said, there's a possibility we might do a compilation of kind of the best stuff from the papers, but we're not doing this. A couple of them came down and met with me in my office and said, we don't have a problem with the project so long as you're not implying that, this is a volume of Joseph Smith papers. But they were really quite supportive, at least those that I talked to, and very emphatic. This is not something we're doing. Mm-hmm. So we didn't want to step on their toes, steal something they wanted or they were planning on doing.
Sure.
But when they said it wasn't part of their project, we thought, well, it needs to be out there. So we will jump in and do it.
So let me ask you this. These are the 3 questions that we ask everyone who steps into the cultural hall. The first couple are pretty quick, pretty easy. And then the third allows some reflection and contemplation. First question is, do you have a calling right now? And if so, what is it?
Rich?
I was just released as the gospel doctrine teacher after 13 years.
Wow.
I know. And now I'm the Sunday school president.
Okay. What about you?
I'm the young men's president in my ward.
Okay. If you could pick a calling for yourself, either one that exists or make one up, what would you pick?
Rich?
Since I'm essentially, oh, I can't say it. I was gonna, because that will throw somebody under a bus. Never mind. I'll tell you what. I've said this before. Uh, there's always been a guy up at church headquarters who is the determiner of doctrine. He's the correlation head. He decides what's doctrine. I want to be that guy. I want to decide. I want to decide. Yeah, no, we're putting that out. No, we're not doing that. I like that. That's out. I want to be the guy who decides
The
officially.
doctrine decider. I like that. I've never
That's
had
right.
anyone want to be that. What about for you, Alonzo?
Oh man, if I could choose my next calling, it would probably be deity. You know, the guy in charge of assigning resurrection, something along that.
Hey, wait, just wait. You'll get there. Don't
Well, you know,
I don't know. I don't know.
you, do you have a calling though? If you could pick one, I'm going to pin you down on this. Is there a calling, either one that exists or one that you would make up that you're like, that's the thing?
I really don't. You know, I didn't teach gospel doctrine as long as Rich, but I taught it for a few years in a row and thought that was a great calling. But I don't. You know, I don't know that I've ever had a calling I didn't enjoy other than scouts. In full disclosure.
And you got us to get rid of it. Get
There you
rid
go.
of
I
it. So
did
there
that.
you go.
Yeah.
The power he wields, everyone. You have no idea.
I did love gospel doctrine teacher. I think that's been my favorite call through the years, and I've had a lot of different ones. But yeah,
Yeah, I'll tell you just for a little bit of context. Most people pick primary chorister or primary pianist, even if they don't have the skills to play the piano. A lot of people really like that idea as a calling. That would be how I would go inactive if people asked me to be in that calling. I'm like, church is true, but we're not doing this. The last question, gentlemen, and Alonzo, because you've continuously made Rich go first, I'm making you go first for this one. But here's the question. And you get to interpret this question however you would like. But the question remains, what is your favorite part of your faith?
My favorite part of my faith. Wow, that's challenging. Rich?
Oh, don't you dare. Don't you dare.
You know, look.
doing cleanup, Alonzo. I'm doing cleanup.
There you
so
go.
ahead.
I was very active in the Orthodox faith, and you know, spent the better part of 2 decades of my life in that, and it was very meaningful for me. I think my favorite part of my faith, just you know, shooting from the hip, is probably the impact that the Church of Jesus Christ has had on every aspect of my life. You know, I converted in college, Richie, and I was even recently just contemplating how impactful it has been in what I've done with my life professionally, who I married, how I've raised my kids, how I think, my daily pursuits, my time in the temple, the things I've written, the things I studied in college. There isn't a component of my life it isn't impacted. And while I loved Orthodoxy and I still love that religion, the Church of Jesus Christ has given me meaning and purpose for my existence. I recently, as I said, was thinking about this and just had the thought, you know, I assume I would still be a decent person or striving to be a decent person if I were Greek Orthodox. But the degree to which I understand what that decency should look like, I attribute to Christ and his gospel. And so it has been everything in my life and who I've sought to be and who I'm still trying to be. And I'm just grateful for the remarkable impact it's had when I just had no idea that converting was going to do what it has done for me and to me. I just thought I had found a different version of the church that was the original ancient version. And I had no view or vision as a young college student that this was going to completely evolve my existence. So grateful for that.
All right, Rich.
So my favorite part of you know, I guess this is hard. Maybe it's a two-parter. Um, the testimony that I have felt through the years, the witnesses that I have felt through the years of the doctrines, of the teachings of prophets, and the the understanding that has given me, the peace that has given me, and then part two is just people I've been blessed to associate with who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ. I have friends outside of those who are great people, but there's something about my good friends in the church that it's been such a blessing to me, and to be in a just to be in a ward setting where you know you have people you can count on and trust, or if I go outside the ward, I have people who I can totally count on to to help me out in any time of need. And I know you can find that in other religions as well. I get that. But
Sure.
I'm just saying for me, it's been the testimony and the witnesses, and then the people.
Well, the name of the book is The Revised and Expanded Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, compared with the earliest known manuscripts. That is a mouthful, but you can find a link for it for you to be able to purchase it in the show notes for this episode. Alonzo and Rich, we hope that this episode has nourished and strengthened your body, that if you are not healthy enough to listen this week, that you will be healthy enough to listen next week, and that when the time comes, you will be able to travel home in safety. In the meantime, Chris at Alpine Lakes Travel, Debbie Wanless, Chocolate Cake Bites Podcast, and the Tiger, with a U, will be saving a seat for you on the back row of the Cultural Hall.
Save me a seat, it's sure to be neat on the back row.